Hey guys, tonight we drift into the dim edges of medieval imagination, where the landscape feels just unfamiliar enough that you squint at shadows and second guess your own eyes. You're standing on a narrow village path right now, boots damp from evening dew, and ahead of you flickering in the reeds, little lights pulse like someone gently breathing in the dark. They glow, wink, drift, and then hover just long enough for you to wonder if they're waiting for you. You probably won't survive this if you get too close, but hey, that's part of the charm of a medieval evening stroll. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a slow breath as the lights shimmer again, those strange, glowing marsh lights that medieval folks whispered about endlessly. Will-o'-the-wisps, they call them now, but to the people around you, peasants who've never been more than a day's ride from home, they're spiritual lanterns drifting through the world like restless candles. Some say they're fairies with an unhelpful sense of humor. Others say they're lost souls who didn't get the memo about moving on. You step closer, pretending to be braver than you feel, because second-person you is very heroic today. The marsh is quiet, except for the gentle slap of mud against your shoes. Nothing dramatic, no cinematic jump scares, just the soggy soundtrack of medieval wetlands. A low mist curls along the ground like a lazy cat settling in for the night. The light nearest you flickers pale blue for a moment, which definitely wasn't on the brochure, and you can't help but lift your hand as if it might land on your palm. The locals would absolutely scold you for this. They believe these lights lure wanderers off safe paths, coaxing them toward deep water or bog holes. Don't follow the ghost lanterns, they'd say, unless you want to meet your ancestors early. And though that sounds like a threat, it's more of a resigned warning medieval people are used to the world acting weird. A mainstream historical fact slips in quietly, like a librarian shelving a book. Many medieval travelers genuinely reported these lights, especially in marshy areas, rich with decaying plant matter. Today, we'd explain it with natural gases, usually phosphine or methane, that ignite spontaneously when exposed to oxygen. Nothing mystical, nothing sentient, just chemistry, doing its best impression of a paranormal tour guide. But here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval chroniclers insisted the lights weren't just floating, they danced. They rose, dipped, spiraled, and, in one unforgettable account, politely escorted a monk across a swamp by hovering ahead of him like a celestial crossing guard. That monk probably earned 3 months of being side-eyed by his entire monastery, but the story stuck. You step a bit deeper into the marsh, enough that your foot makes that embarrassing squish sound you hope no one hears. The glowing orb trembles like a candle encountering a draft. It drifts backward, almost inviting you, though you tell yourself you're not falling for that trick. You've seen enough medieval art to know that following anything glowing usually ends with you illustrated in the corner of a tapestry, looking confused. Historians still argue whether will-o'-the-wisp stories were exaggerated to keep children from wandering into dangerous wetlands, or whether adults genuinely believed the lights had intent. Some scholars even suggest the tales blended natural phenomena with folklore carried over from earlier Celtic traditions. Others grumble that everyone back then just needed better evening entertainment. You crouch down, imagining the villagers who once stood on this same squelchy soil, clutching lanterns and muttering superstitions. They'd tell you that the lights were tricksters, sometimes friendly, sometimes mischievous, but never predictable. One old woman might lean close and whisper, "If the light brightens, it's to warn you. If it dims, it's laughing at you." Another might swear that throwing bread at it keeps it away. You make a mental note. Bread solves a surprising number of medieval problems. As the night deepens, you hear frogs croaking, crickets chirping, and somewhere far off, a cow making the kind of noise that suggests absolutely nothing good is happening in its life. You clutch your cloak a bit tighter. The air smells of damp earth and something faintly metallic, maybe just your imagination, maybe marsh gas. maybe the medieval equivalent of someone microwaving leftovers. Marvelously ambiguous, just how your sleepy brain likes it. The light drifts sideways and you follow, but only a little. You're not reckless, you're curious. Big difference. It bobs near a clump of reeds, illuminating the slender blades with a soft silver glow. You half expect a tiny fairy to step out, introduce itself, and complain about work-life balance. Instead, the orb flickers out entirely. Gone. Poof. You blink. Nothing. You stand still as the night wraps around you. Then there it is again, but now 10 steps to your left. Classic medieval move. Disappear dramatically and reappear just when someone thinks they're safe. You can practically hear the villagers muttering, "Yep, that's how it gets you." You take a cautious step back. You're not letting some supernatural glow convince you to hop into a bog. You retreat toward firmer ground, where the mud clings but doesn't threaten to slurp your shoes off like a hungry pudding. The orb holds its place this time, as if respecting your boundaries. That's nice. Even supernatural phenomena can practice healthy communication, apparently. A breeze glides through the marsh, stirring the mist. You rub your arms and remember a story you overheard in the market earlier. Something about a traveler who tried to chase these lights and ended up circling the marsh all night until dawn revealed he'd been walking in loops around a single tree. He insisted the light mocked him with every pass, which is equal parts sad and slightly hilarious. Another faint glow stirs in the distance, but you've learned your lesson. You stay where you are and watch from afar as the lights pulse gently, like sleepy fireflies doing slow yoga. You feel a calm settle in your chest. Even in a world of unpredictable lights, misbehaving marshes, and villagers who think every weird glow is a spirit with opinions, you realize you can just breathe here. And as you exhale, the mist settles, the lights dim, and nighttime in the medieval countryside softens around you, inviting you forward into the next quiet oddity that waits beyond the marsh. You leave the marsh behind, brushing stray bits of reed from your clothes as you walk. The ground grows firmer beneath your feet, and the night settles into a quieter rhythm crickets humming steadily, wind threading softly through distant oaks. You follow a narrow track curving up a gentle rise, guided mostly by the moon, which is doing its best impression of a medieval flashlight. At the top of the hill, you pause. The villagers told you something odd, waited here, something they claimed would make your feet feel a bit inadequate. They weren't wrong. As you step closer, you see it. An indentation in the soil nearly twice the length of your boot, and another beside it. Then another, in a lazy, meandering line that stretches toward the tree line like someone taking an evening stroll with very, very large feet. Traveling giants' footprints. Or, so the story goes. You crouch beside one of the impressions, tracing its outline with your fingers. The moonlight catches the edges, making it look almost sculpted. Medieval villagers would gather around these marks, wide-eyed and whispering, convinced that only something enormous, lumbering, and surprisingly well-coordinated could have left them. And because you're fully committed to this second-person adventure, you try to imagine such a creature, a gentle giant with a walk slow enough to make a tortoise say, "Pick up the pace." A mainstream historical fact floats into your thoughts like a leaf drifting on a pond. Many medieval communities genuinely believed giants once roamed the earth. Some of this came from Old Norse and Celtic legends. Some came from biblical interpretations, and some came from the accidental discovery of enormous prehistoric bones, usually mammoth or whale, remains misidentified as human. Without paleontology textbooks, villagers pieced together stories using the logic available to them, which was mostly, this bone is huge, people aren't this huge, therefore giants. You step from one enormous footprint to the next, feeling slightly ridiculous as you stretch your stride to match. You look like you're doing a medieval version of exaggerated lunges, but nobody is here to judge you except maybe a particularly judgmental owl in the branches above. The soil is slightly sunken, but you notice something odd. The prints seem too evenly spaced, too tidy, almost as though made by a wagon wheel or the side of a barrel pressed repeatedly into the ground. That's your modern brain speaking. Medieval villagers didn't bother with such skepticism. Instead, they brought bread offerings, because medieval people will throw bread at anything even slightly confusing, whispered prayers, and sometimes tried to measure the prints with rope so they could brag about it later. One quirky tidbit springs to mind. An old chronicle from northern France described gargantuan steps appearing overnight near a monastery. The monks debated their origin and eventually concluded they belonged to a peaceful giant who liked to bathe at dawn in a nearby river. The chronicle notes, very seriously, that his preferred soap smelled of pine, which is possibly the most wholesome giant lore ever. Historians still argue whether such footprint discoveries were caused by natural erosion, exaggerated eyewitness accounts, or the occasional prank by bored farmhands who realized they could make a massive impression using carefully carved wooden boards strapped to their boots. You can imagine one medieval teenager proudly stomping around thinking, "Future archaeologists are going to love this." You continue tracing the path of the giant, following the impressions toward the dark line of the woods. The air grows cooler as you descend the hill, the scent of damp leaves and moss rising around you. Another footprint waits at the base of an ancient oak, this one slightly shallower, as though the giant hesitated before entering the forest. You mentally note that even imaginary giants possess better survival instincts than you sometimes do. As you approach the trees, you hear the gentle rustle of branches, the soft flutter of wings, and for just a moment, something like a deep, rhythmic thrum. Probably wind. Probably. Definitely wind. Yes. Don't think too hard about it. Villagers have plenty of stories to explain why giants roam, but never linger. Some say they prefer the high mountains and only wander down to the lowlands when the moon is especially full. Others insist giants are shy, easily startled by bells, loud voices, or people yelling, "Hey, come look at this treasure I found." And in one very dramatic tale, a giant left the region entirely because he stepped on a goose and felt so guilty he moved 3 valleys over. You glance back at the path behind you and imagine medieval children boasting, "I saw the giant first," or "I heard his sneeze echo across the marsh." Meanwhile, adults whispered practical concerns like, "Do giants pay tolls? And if he accidentally bumps my barn, does that count as an act of God, or is he liable?" Medieval law was deeply unprepared for giant-related insurance claims. A fresh breeze stirs the treetops, and you follow the last visible footprint to a shallow stream. Here, the soil becomes too wet to hold a clean impression, though you swear you see one faint depression near the water's edge. The villagers told you giants liked stopping at rivers to drink, scoop water, or admire their reflections. Personally, you like imagining a giant leaning down, squinting at his own face and thinking, need a haircut. You rest beside the stream, dipping your fingers into the cold water. Moonlight scatters across the ripples, and the forest settles into a calm hum. Crickets trade melodies with the occasional hoot from an owl that sounds mildly unimpressed with your presence. You take a slow breath, letting the night wrap around you like a cloak. Somewhere in the distance, a fox barks its voice sharp but brief before everything falls quiet again. You study the tree line, half expecting a shadow to move, a branch to shift, or something very tall to duck behind a tree. But nothing stirs. If a giant did pass through here, it was long ago, long enough that the story remains only in footprints, whispers, and the warm certainty villagers once felt that the world was full of wonders much larger than themselves. Looking back along the trail of impressions, you feel an odd fondness for the idea. Not fear, not awe, just a peaceful sense that the medieval world allowed room for stories big enough to fill entire valleys and strange enough to leave footprints behind for curious travelers like you. As you rise, brushing dew from your hands, the night invites you onward. This path, lined with impossible steps, gently nudges you toward the next oddity waiting to reveal itself in the sleeping medieval countryside. The ground begins to slant downward as you leave the footprints behind, and the scent of wet earth mixes with something faintly briny, as if the nearby river has wandered off to meet the sea. You walk slowly, letting your eyes adjust to the moonlit contours of the village ahead when suddenly plop, 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 tiny shapes strike the cobblestones. You glance upward just in time to see them, a scattering of small, slippery fish tumbling from the sky. Your first thought is disbelief, and your second is, well, this is medieval times, so perhaps this is normal. Medieval villagers had a particular fascination with phenomena like this, which they often interpreted as messages from the heavens. Rain of fish, frogs, or even small birds was typically read as a sign of divine intervention, a warning, or a promise of coming change. You stare in mild awe as the tiny fish twirl in the moonlight before splatting against stone and straw. Their silver scales shimmer faintly, and for a moment, you swear one looks at you as if to say, "Welcome to your medieval destiny." A mainstream historical fact slips into your awareness. Records from medieval Europe contain numerous accounts of raining fish, most often after flash floods or unusual weather patterns. Sometimes the fish were swept from nearby rivers or lakes into storm clouds. Sometimes the explanation was simply lost to legend. You lift one gently, feeling its slick, cold skin, and imagine a medieval child's delighted squeal or panic at the miracle falling from above. Here's your quirky tidbit. One 14th century chronicler claimed a shower of small eels hit his village precisely during a dispute over church taxes, leading the locals to reinterpret it as the vengeful work of water spirits displeased with civic administration. The narrative, unsurprisingly, did nothing to calm the tax collectors. Historians still argue whether these stories were genuine meteorological oddities, symbolic tales, or a combination of both. Some suggest scribes exaggerated the events to make moral points, while others believe villagers simply wanted an excuse to leave work early and talk about it for years. Either way, you're standing here, in real time, participating in the same awe and confusion those villagers felt centuries ago. You duck beneath a low branch and notice the fish rolling in shallow puddles along the street. You pick one up and toss it lightly into a barrel of rainwater. It flops and twitches, refusing to offer any advice about life or taxes. In the distance, a dog barks at the sudden, unexpected rainfall, probably confused by the local definition of weather. The peculiar sensation of witnessing an actual skyfall continues to ripple through the village. Lanterns swing gently in doorways, their orange light reflecting off puddles, and the occasional villager emerges, umbrella-less, laughing nervously or muttering prayers. You wonder if anyone else is asking the same question you are. What do we do with all these fish? Modern kitchens have freezers. Medieval kitchens have open fires and cats. In a charmingly odd twist, some medieval accounts mention that local priests would bless the falling fish, interpreting them as literal gifts from God. In one story, the bishop's attempt to organize a communal fish fry ended abruptly when the blessed catch wriggled too enthusiastically and jumped back into the street. You can almost hear him sighing, "I blessed them, but they clearly had their own plans." As you walk through this temporary fish-laden wonderland, you notice that each fallen creature seems to tell its own story. Tiny fins sparkle faintly in lantern light, and you start imagining what it would have been like for medieval villagers to navigate life, suddenly asked to interpret cosmic messages in the form of small aquatic animals. Your imagination is mildly overwhelmed, but in the most delightful way. You pause at the edge of the market square and lean down to inspect the largest fish, roughly the size of a hand. Medieval townsfolk would probably have debated whether it signified a boon, a warning, or a reminder to keep nets on hand. You half expect someone to whisper, "Take it to the apothecary. It might cure your hiccups," because medieval logic often combines practical survival tips with supernatural interpretation. And honestly, you're not sure which advice to follow, so you decide to simply watch and let the moment sink in. The night grows quieter, though tiny splashes accompany your every step. You wonder how many of these fish have stories of their own, journeys from river to cloud to cobblestone, participating unwittingly in human superstition and awe. You kneel briefly, letting your fingers trail through a small puddle where a few fish continue their erratic dance. One flips onto its side, and you gently set it upright, feeling a strange kinship with the creatures that fell from the heavens. Historians still argue whether the accounts were intended to teach moral lessons, explain environmental anomalies, or simply entertain. You lean back against a stall, the scent of wet straw and smoke curling in the cool night air, and realize that, whether divine intervention or natural oddity, the experience is quietly enchanting. The air carries a faint, metallic tang from the rain, a reminder that history is never just about what happened, it's about how it felt to those living through it. The rest of the village slowly reemerges as the rainfall of fish slows, each person gingerly stepping over or around the remnants of the miraculous shower. You follow the slick cobblestones to the edge of town, letting the rhythmic splashes beneath your boots become a hypnotic lullaby of sorts. The moon glances off wet rooftops, and for a fleeting moment, it's easy to forget that you're in medieval times at all. Or perhaps that's exactly the point. To step into someone else's awe, wonder, and quiet confusion. A gentle breeze brushes past, carrying the faint scent of river water and distant smoke. You take a deep breath and let yourself smile, remembering that history is full of these small, astonishing events, moments that, though unexplained, leave you feeling connected to those long-ago lives, even if they involved a little skybound fish. The village square is quiet now, slick with moonlit puddles and the remnants of sky-fallen fish. You move on, shoes squelching softly against the wet cobbles, and as you pass the edge of a small chapel, you notice it. A wooden saint statue, perched on a stone pedestal, looking exactly as it did in every story you'd ever heard, or so you thought. But when you blink, it's slightly turned, facing a different direction than when you first saw it. You pause, a shiver of amusement, or is it anticipation, running down your spine. Walking saint statues were a favorite subject of medieval gossip. Villagers swore that certain saints, usually made of carved oak or pine, had the habit of changing positions overnight. Maybe they had stepped aside to give a child better sight during Mass, or perhaps they were testing the faith of local worshippers. The accounts vary widely, and as second-person you feel the thrill of slowly approaching a silent miracle. A mainstream historical fact. Many of these claims were tied to the practice of pilgrimage and relic veneration. Statues were carefully maintained, polished, and moved during ceremonies. A tiny shift of the pedestal, a bumped elbow, or even a settling floorboard could create the appearance of miraculous movement. Villagers, however, rarely considered mundane explanations. First, they preferred the drama and wonder of a saint with literal legs. One quirky tidbit floats to mind. A 13th century English chronicle mentions a statue of St. Cuthbert allegedly walking through the monastery cloisters at night, pausing only to glare at monks who had slept through their prayers. Apparently, one brave novice tried to follow it and woke up the next morning standing by the abbey gate, convinced he had witnessed divine stealth training. Historians still argue whether these statues were truly considered animate or if the stories served a symbolic function, teaching moral vigilance and attentiveness to the sacred. Perhaps the walking was less about literal motion and more about a reminder to remain aware, faithful, and slightly nervous. As you crouch to inspect the saint's delicate carved hands, you notice a tiny chip near the wrist, maybe an old hiccup of history, maybe proof that the statue really did get around a little at night. You circle the pedestal, imagining the saint's wooden gaze following your every move. It's eerily calming in the way that anything moving without explanation can be. The village cat brushes past your ankle, unimpressed by centuries of mystical reputation, and you realize that some witnesses were probably more terrified than reverent, or possibly just jealous of the saint's nocturnal mobility. Medieval accounts often included miracle verification by priests or local elders. A series of measurements, sketches, and interviews would accompany reports of moving statues, sometimes leading to minor controversies over whether the saint was benevolent, playful, or just plain restless. You imagine an entire debate over a wooden figure that apparently had a very active social life. The statue's polished surface reflects moonlight, giving it a faint, otherworldly glow. You run a finger along the smooth curve of its shoulder, half expecting a whisper, half expecting nothing at all. And in the quiet, you notice the tiny shadows around its feet, the subtle imperfection of carved drapery, and the uncanny sense that this object has witnessed centuries of whispered prayers, hurried footsteps, and long nights, much like this one. A quirky fringe note. Some chroniclers insisted that when the saints moved, they occasionally left small objects in their weight coins, scraps of parchment, or the tiniest flowers from a garden no one remembered planting. You wonder, not for the first time, whether medieval saints were actually just early adopters of randomized treasure drops. As you step back, your shadow mingles with the statues, and you feel the rhythm of centuries pressing lightly against the present. Historians still argue whether the anecdotes were meant to inspire piety, instill fear, or simply amuse, but you realize the effect is undeniable. There is a subtle, hypnotic magic in imagining that ordinary objects might harbor tiny, unexpected life. You continue your stroll through the village, leaving the walking saint behind, ears tuned to the distant croak of frogs and the soft trickle of a night stream. The cool air carries the faint scent of wet wood and incense from the chapel, blending naturally into the night's symphony. You take a breath and smile. The medieval world has revealed yet another gentle, unexplainable oddity, one that insists you walk a little slower, observe a little closer, and embrace the quiet marvels hidden in plain sight. And with that, you drift on, feet wet but spirits oddly lifted, toward the next gentle strangeness that medieval nights hold in store. You leave the chapel behind, the echoes of whispered prayers fading into the damp night air. The cobblestones give way to a frost-dusted meadow, and as you trudge forward, your boots crunch softly in the white fluff covering the grass. But this isn't ordinary frost. As you bend down and touch it, it feels strangely thick and soft, almost like wool. Medieval villagers called it snow that looked like wool, and you can see why they imagined the heavens shedding scraps from celestial weaving. You kneel, letting the cold fluff sift between your fingers, marveling at its peculiar texture. The sensation is oddly comforting, almost like the world has offered you a blanket made of pure moonlight. Villagers, of course, were enchanted and slightly bewildered. Some believed it heralded divine favor. Others whispered that angels had been repairing the sky's tapestry. You probably won't survive this without laughing quietly at the absurdity of thinking the sky does embroidery, but there's a peaceful rhythm in imagining it anyway. A mainstream historical fact, snowfall patterns in medieval Europe could sometimes leave unusually fluffy or light accumulations, especially when blown by gentle winds across open fields. With limited meteorological understanding, people often interpreted odd weather as messages or gifts from the divine. Your wool-like snow fits neatly into that mindset, blurring the lines between natural phenomena and mystical interpretation. One quirky tidbit: in a 15th century chronicle from northern France, villagers described the snow collecting in perfect miniature rosettes on rooftops and hedges, resembling tiny knitted squares. They attributed this marvel to a particularly industrious group of domestic angels. The chronicler noted that children were delighted using the fluff to decorate the village chickens, which, in hindsight, seems like a questionable idea, but was apparently charming at the time. Historians still argue whether these stories were genuine eyewitness accounts or playful exaggerations by scribes aiming to illustrate divine benevolence. Some believe the wool snow narrative was partly an allegory for grace and protection, offering reassurance in harsh, often unpredictable winters. Others argue that people simply liked attributing personality to the weather, imagining gentle, invisible hands at work. You rise, brushing the cold fluff from your sleeves, and continue along the meadow's edge. The pale light glints off frost-coated reeds, turning the landscape into a glittering tapestry. You notice a rabbit pause, its nose twitching as it surveys the unusual softness of the ground, and you realize that even the wildlife is uncertain how to interpret this peculiar phenomenon. You might imagine medieval peasants leaning on their staffs, eyes wide, whispering, "Heaven's knitting again, mark my words." As you walk, the snow wool crunches beneath your feet in a satisfying muted rhythm. The experience feels hypnotic, almost like the world itself is setting a gentle, lulling pace. You start to wonder what it would be like to live in a time when everyday oddities could inspire stories, superstitions, and quiet contemplation. Every footstep seems to carry centuries of imagination along with it. One amusing thought occurs. Some chroniclers insisted that this woolly snow was so soft that it could be rolled into tiny balls and used to polish silver. You briefly consider testing it on your own shoes, though practical sense reminds you that modern footwear might not appreciate celestial cleaning methods. Nevertheless, you smile at the idea. Medieval life often mixed the mystical with the mundane, and somehow both coexisted beautifully. The wind stirs through the meadow, lifting small tufts of snow that drift lazily across the moonlight. You follow the faint path of the fluff, imagining angels peeking down with amused expressions. Perhaps they are tending to the world in their own quiet way, watching, stitching, and occasionally nudging events just slightly. You inhale deeply, enjoying the crisp scent of night air mixed with frost, and appreciate the subtle thrill of witnessing a natural oddity transformed into something magical. Historians still argue whether wool-like snow was commonly recognized across medieval Europe or if specific accounts were local folklore. Regardless, the stories capture a gentle interplay between observation and imagination, inviting you to linger in wonder and appreciate the soft, surreal moments tucked within ordinary landscapes. You trudge onward, boots crunching, eyes glancing at the distant horizon where the next strange marvel waits patiently, ready to reveal itself. You leave the wool-like snow behind, your boots damp but your curiosity thoroughly warmed. The meadow gradually slopes upward, and as you approach a low hill, you catch sight of a silhouette against the moon, a windmill. Not just any windmill, though. This one has metal fittings that glint faintly, and as a gentle breeze rustles its sails, a strange, haunting tone drifts toward you. It's a singing iron windmill, something medieval villagers insisted could predict the harvest or communicate secret messages from the natural world. You pause at the base, tilting your head to listen. The wind causes the iron to vibrate, creating a low, resonant hum that wavers between comforting and eerie. To the villagers, these sounds weren't merely mechanical. They were alive, singing softly across fields like a cautious friend, whispering good fortune, or perhaps reminding them to check the grain stores. You might think it's just the physics of metal and wind, but medieval ears heard prophecy and personality in every creak and whistle. A mainstream historical fact. Many early windmills in medieval Europe incorporated iron fittings to strengthen wooden structures and support the sails. The metal would naturally vibrate when the wind caught the edges just so, producing sounds that likely startled or delighted nearby peasants. Some medieval chroniclers interpreted these acoustic oddities as messages from saints or spirits, lending supernatural significance to otherwise functional structures. Here's a quirky tidbit. One chronicle describes a Dutch windmill that produced a pitch so low it supposedly mimicked the tones of a cat purring. Villagers, intrigued and slightly unnerved, began to consult it for farming advice, timing, planting, and harvesting by the rhythms of the hum. You imagine standing there, notebook in hand, pondering which crop corresponds to a particularly high-pitched creak. Historians still argue whether medieval windmill songs were genuinely used to make agricultural predictions, or if these were later embellishments by storytellers seeking to highlight human ingenuity. It's possible the windmill's voice was noticed by observant peasants, exaggerated in local lore, and eventually enshrined in charming legends passed down over generations. You circle the base of the windmill, noting the interplay of shadows and the moonlight glinting off rivets and edges. The vibration reverberates faintly under your palms as you run your fingers along a sturdy beam. It's alive, in the way that all functional medieval engineering seems alive if you give it a moment and the right attitude. You imagine a miller leaning on his crutch, listening to the hum and thinking, "Yep, today is a good day to grind wheat," or perhaps, "Better watch the weather." A fringe curiosity surfaces. In a few rare accounts, The singing was said to carry messages from neighboring villages, almost like a low-frequency communication network. Of course, these claims remain speculative, and you can't help but smile at the medieval desire to find personality and intent in every sound. The windmill hums, patient and steadfast, indifferent to the layers of meaning projected onto it, yet quietly fulfilling its role in the landscape. You pause to lie back on the grassy hill, letting the hum wash over you. The night air is cool, carrying faint scents of distant haystacks and a hint of iron tang from the windmill. Crickets provide an understated percussion, a gentle accompaniment to the low, resonant melody. You can imagine villagers sitting on nearby hillsides, tilting their heads, taking the sound as reassurance that the world is orderly, even if unpredictably strange. Another small laugh escapes you when you recall one chronicler who described the iron hum as the windmill clearing its throat before telling secrets. You can almost hear it, a long, drawn-out creak, followed by a softer, conversational sigh. Medieval imagination often blended humor with interpretation, and you're momentarily charmed by the notion that inanimate objects might have their own personalities and agendas. Historians still argue whether the mystical significance of singing windmills was widely recognized or mostly anecdotal, but you notice that for a brief moment, standing here in the moonlit hill, it doesn't matter. The mechanical hum has become a lullaby of sorts, a slow, persistent melody that carries the weight of centuries of observation, superstition, and gentle delight. You rise, brushing grass from your clothes, and feel ready to continue into the next quiet, peculiar marvel waiting to emerge in the medieval night. The windmill's low hum fades behind you as you descend the hill, boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp grass. Ahead, the forest thickens, and a faint glow catches your eye between the trees. You step closer and discover a small clearing dotted with what appear to be tiny lanterns, dozens of them, hovering above the ground like stars fallen to earth. Only these are not stars, nor do they hang from any visible support. The villagers call them will-o'-the-wisps, playful spirits that tease travelers or guide the lost, depending on who's telling the story. You tread lightly, following the soft flicker, noting how each lantern seems to respond to your presence. Step closer, and it drifts slightly away. Pause, and it hovers patiently. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval European folklore is full of accounts of will-o'-the-wisps, phosphorescent marsh gases that ignite under certain conditions. To the untrained eye, a dancing light in a dark forest was inexplicable, and villagers often wove moral or mystical narratives around these natural phenomena. A quirky tidbit: one chronicler claimed that a particularly mischievous will-o'-the-wisp led an entire wedding procession in circles for hours, returning them safely only after the bride laughed at the spirit's antics. You imagine medieval guests tripping over roots, clutching gowns and sashes, all while cursing the sky and the luminous mischief simultaneously. The combination of fear, fascination, and eventual amusement is delightfully human. Historians still argue whether the accounts were purely metaphorical, warnings against venturing into dangerous marshlands at night, or true sightings of natural phenomena misinterpreted through the lens of superstition. Either way, you can appreciate the subtle thrill of stepping into a clearing lit by flickering, unaccountable light. You move deeper, the lanterns bobbing gently like tiny dancers. The scent of damp earth and pine fills the air, mingling with the faintly sweet aroma of wildflowers you can barely make out in the moonlight. One light hovers directly ahead, almost coaxing you forward. You follow it, trying not to think too hard about what might be waiting, though the possibility of a harmless prankster or the tiniest forest sprite crosses your mind. Your imagination, finely tuned by centuries of legends, keeps you alert but pleasantly calm. Another fringe detail: some villagers insisted that if you tossed a coin near a willow, the wisp, and bowed politely, it would guide you safely home, perhaps even granting a minor blessing. You smile at the combination of civility and superstition. Medieval etiquette extended even to ethereal annoyances, it seems. You step over a moss-covered log, eyes tracking the lights like a sailor following stars across a calm sea. The soft hum of insects harmonizes with the gentle crackle of distant leaves, creating an ambient backdrop for this delicate nocturnal ballet. You notice a tiny frog leaping into one of the shallow puddles, sending ripples through the reflection of a hovering lantern. The moment is quietly magical, as if the world itself has paused to watch. Historians still argue whether the stories surrounding will-o'-the-wisps served as cautionary tales for travelers or simply as entertainment, passed orally from generation to generation. Regardless, the effect is immediate and tangible. You feel like an intruder in a world simultaneously eerie and tender, strange yet welcoming. You linger in the clearing, absorbing the hypnotic dance of light and shadow. Your footsteps are muffled by the soft moss, and you feel a subtle rhythm in the gentle sway of the lanterns. Each flicker seems to convey a story, perhaps a fragment of medieval life, or a hint of a long-forgotten trickster spirit, and you realize that, for a moment, you've stepped entirely outside time. Finally, with a gentle exhale, you move on, letting the will-o'-the-wisps drift behind you, their teasing glow gradually fading into the darkened forest. The trail ahead beckons, promising another quiet marvel, another oddity from the endlessly inventive medieval imagination, and you step forward, eager to continue this slow, hypnotic journey. You leave the will-o'-the-wisps behind, the forest closing gently around you as the soft crunch of your boots on leaf-strewn paths becomes the night's only accompaniment. A thin mist rises from the ground, curling around tree trunks like pale, cautious fingers. The villagers would call this ghost smoke, a natural fog imbued with mysterious qualities, and you, walking alone, can almost hear them whispering, "Tread carefully, for spirits wander where the mist clings longest." Of course, your modern self suspects nothing more sinister than water vapor and temperature inversion, but there's a pleasant thrill in suspending logic. As you press deeper into the mist, you notice shapes forming in the gray folds, small, ornate cages hanging from low branches. At first glance, they look decorative, perhaps a whimsical woodland art installation. But then you realize that inside each cage rests a tiny clay figurine, meticulously painted and arranged. These are medieval plague dolls, miniature representations of people created to protect against illness or misfortune. You pause, brushing your fingers over one's delicate features, marveling at the care even in these tiny charms. A mainstream historical fact: during outbreaks of disease, villagers in parts of Europe and the British Isles made small effigies as protective talismans, sometimes burying them, sometimes hanging them in homes or near gardens. The intention was to capture bad luck, misfortune, or even contagion in a symbolic form, keeping the household safe. You realize the medieval mind had a peculiar balance of caution, creativity, and hope expressed in these small, intricate objects. A quirky tidbit. One chronicler described a particularly persistent doll that, according to local lore, wandered from home to home, only returning to its original branch after several nights. Some believed it moved on its own, guided by unseen spirits. Others swore that mischievous children were responsible, but nobody ever caught them in the act. You imagine trying to follow such a doll, boots sticking in the mist, feeling more like a detective in a sleepy, magical fog than a traveler through history. Historians still argue whether plague dolls were primarily practical charms, imaginative explanations of disease, or community-building rituals, but it's clear they served as comforting symbols amid the uncertainty of medieval life. You step carefully around the hanging cages, letting your eyes linger on each one, noting the tiny painted eyes that seem to look back at you, patient, solemn, and strangely soothing. You notice the mist thickening, creating halos around the low lanterns tied to some of the larger trees. The diffused light catches on the edges of the cages, making them appear almost suspended in liquid silver. One figurine seems particularly well loved, its paint worn, with a tiny patch of straw tucked under its chin. You imagine the hands that made it, the care that went into a piece meant to ward off unseen forces, and feel a comforting connection across time. A fringe detail, In certain regions, villagers would occasionally feed the dolls small offerings, crumbs of bread, a drop of honey, or a coin to maintain their protective power. You picture a medieval night scene of villagers tiptoeing through misty fields, making tiny gestures of devotion to clay figures dangling from branches, perhaps whispering reassurances or apologies. The scene is quietly enchanting, a blend of superstition, care, and ritual that feels almost cinematic. You pause to lean against a tree, inhaling the cool, damp air. The forest is alive with subtle noises, the drip of condensation from leaves, the occasional rustle of small animals, and the soft sigh of the wind weaving through the mist. Each sound accentuates the otherworldly atmosphere, heightening the sense of stepping into a world where everyday life mingled seamlessly with gentle magic. Historians still argue whether these figurines were meant to replace more formal religious practices or supplement them. But standing here, you realize the ambiguity is part of their charm. The mist, the dolls, the quiet interplay of shadow and lantern glow create a medieval tableau that seems both protective and playful. A slow, immersive reminder that the human imagination has always sought comfort and meaning in the smallest things. With one final glance at the hanging figurines, you continue through the mist, leaving their silent vigil behind. The path ahead beckons through the soft, dim woods, promising another subtle marvel in the endless parade of medieval oddities, and you walk onward, feeling the gentle pull of curiosity guiding you deeper into the night's delicate mysteries. The mist thins gradually as you leave the forest behind, revealing the gentle outline of a river glimmering faintly in the moonlight. Its surface shimmers with a curious, almost metallic sheen that catches your eye, and you kneel to peer at the water. Medieval villagers might have called it mercurial currents, a stretch of river that supposedly mirrored not only the moon, but also the whims of the unseen world. You dip a finger in the cool liquid, noting the smooth resistance, the faint silver flicker that seems almost alive. It's oddly calming, like the river itself is breathing with you. A mainstream historical fact: many rivers in medieval Europe carried naturally occurring minerals, sediments, or slight metallic traces, which occasionally reflected light in unusual ways. These visual anomalies often inspired folklore, including stories of enchanted waters that could reveal visions, heal minor ailments, or forewarn travelers of danger. You watch as the gentle ripples stretch outward, shimmering faintly, thinking about the eyes that have gazed here for centuries and the tales they might have woven. Here's a quirky tidbit. A 12th century account from northern Germany describes villagers witnessing fish seemingly leaping in slow motion through liquid silver, interpreted as a blessing from river spirits for the upcoming harvest. In one particularly whimsical note, a fisherman insisted that staring too long into the ripples would allow him to glimpse future moon cycles, though he quickly admitted he fell asleep halfway through the attempt. You can't help but chuckle at the combination of earnest observation and sleepy daydreaming. Historians still argue whether these river legends were meant as moral allegories, cryptic weather warnings, or simply imaginative storytelling. Some suggest that the stories reinforce communal knowledge about safe fishing spots, navigation, or seasonal patterns, wrapped in a layer of gentle mysticism. Whatever the case, standing here, you can see why generations of villagers would regard this stretch of water with both awe and respectful caution. As you step closer to the bank, the cool night air carries a faint tang of mud, riverweed, and distant smoke from a far-off hearth. Tiny insects skim the surface, leaving faint ripples that twinkle in the moonlight. You notice a family of ducks gliding silently across the water, leaving mirrored trails behind them. In a moment of mild absurdity, you imagine medieval children racing to follow the ducks' wake, waving tiny wooden boats in imitation, utterly absorbed in this shimmering nocturnal theater, a fringe observation. Some chroniclers claim that the reflections in certain rivers could show not only the observer but also their ancestors fleetingly appearing among the ripples. You kneel again, imagining the possibility, and allow the thought to drift gently. Whether superstition, metaphor, or imaginative flourish, It's soothing to entertain the idea of a river that quietly carries echoes of long past generations. The riverbank is dotted with smooth stones, each worn from centuries of water and foot traffic. You pick one up, feeling its cool solidity, and imagine it resting in the hands of countless villagers before you children skipping them across the water, monks counting them while lost in thought, perhaps a painter or scribe tracing their shapes in quiet meditation. Even the simplest object becomes a vessel for history when seen in this light. Historians still argue whether the river's silver sheen was widely remarked upon or primarily local lore, but it's clear that these moments of subtle enchantment offered medieval people a sense of wonder and reassurance. You continue along the bank, letting the gentle lapping of the water guide your pace, almost like a lullaby crafted by nature and time itself. The night is quiet, the air cool and soft, and each ripple seems to tell its own story. You pause to take a deep breath, the faint metallic scent mingling with earth and moss, and you feel the centuries pressing lightly but pleasantly against the present. The river stretches on, unhurried, carrying both water and memory. You step forward, boots brushing wet grass, leaving behind the silvered currents, but carrying with you the delicate sense of awe that comes from standing in a place both ordinary and quietly extraordinary. The next wonder awaits just beyond the bend, patient, gentle, and ready to reveal itself in its own peculiar way. You continue along the riverbank, the silvered water gradually fading from view as the terrain rises into rolling hills dotted with hedgerows and wildflowers. The night is still, the kind of silence that feels almost tactile, and then you notice a peculiar sight. A cluster of haystacks arranged in an unusually precise, geometric pattern. At first, you think it's merely the work of diligent peasants, but as you step closer, you realize that each stack bears carved symbols, circles, triangles, and tiny notches that shimmer faintly in the moonlight. These are medieval crop divination stacks, designed to tell fortunes or predict the coming season's abundance. A mainstream historical fact. In parts of medieval Europe, particularly in England and France, villagers would use symbolic markings in hay, grain, or other harvest materials as part of ritual practices. These patterns were believed to influence crop yields or communicate with the supernatural, blending practical agricultural knowledge with symbolic thinking. You can almost hear the quiet footsteps of farmers moving between the stacks, muttering prayers or counting off patterns to ensure success. A quirky tidbit. One chronicler noted that a particularly inventive farmer once arranged his stacks to resemble a giant cat, claiming it would protect the village from mischief and wandering spirits. Locals reportedly observed the cat at sunrise, nodding solemnly, and then went about their day, half in amusement and half in earnest belief that the feline shape might truly safeguard their fields. You chuckle, imagining the villagers squinting at hay sculptures and taking meticulous notes as if auditing the divine. Historians still argue whether these symbolic arrangements were primarily ritualistic, practical, or simply playful community activities. But the effect was clear. A sense of control and meaning over the unpredictable forces of nature. You walk slowly between the haystacks, admiring the care with which the shapes were carved and the subtle variations that distinguish one stack from the next, each a miniature statement of hope and creativity. As you move through the field, the moonlight casts long, exaggerated shadows of the haystacks, turning them into a surreal landscape of towering silhouettes. The air is faintly sweet with straw and earth, mingling with the distant scent of wildflowers. You notice a small mouse scuttling between the stacks, completely uninterested in the symbolic carvings, and it's oddly comforting to see nature continuing its business regardless of human belief or ritual. A fringe detail. Some villagers insisted that stepping carefully between certain stack arrangements could improve dreams, ward off insomnia, or even inspire artistic talent. You pause and take a tentative step along a path bordered by triangles, half expecting some subtle magical effect or at least a faint sense of whimsy to settle into your mind. It's both ridiculous and oddly soothing, the way human imagination can infuse the ordinary with gentle enchantment. You notice faint tracks in the soft earth, likely from horses or farm animals, and imagine the rhythmic passage of daily life over centuries. Each hoofprint or footprint overlaps the previous, creating a layered history of mundane labor, seasonal cycles, and the occasional ceremonial flourish. The geometric patterns in the hay become a subtle map of time itself, a quiet testament to human interaction with the land, nature, and unseen forces. Historians still argue whether such haystack divination was more widespread than surviving records suggest, but standing here in the field, the combination of practical arrangement and symbolic nuance feels timeless. You inhale deeply, the cool night air filling your lungs, and let your eyes linger on the neatly stacked shapes, appreciating the gentle interplay of light, shadow, and meaning. It's a simple, peaceful marvel, one that invites reflection and quiet awe. Finally, you step past the last stack, leaving the carefully patterned field behind. The hills rise gently ahead, and a faint rustle in the distance hints at the next oddity waiting to appear. You feel a soft anticipation, the kind that comes from stepping into centuries-old landscapes rich with imagination, ritual, and subtle delight. The medieval world continues to unfold before you, and you walk onward, the moonlight guiding your path into the next gentle wonder. The hills taper off into a narrow valley where the air feels thicker, carrying the faint, sweet scent of herbs and damp stone. Here, you notice an unusual cluster of stone structures rising from the earth like miniature fortresses. Their walls are low, circular, and oddly haphazard, yet each has a tiny doorway, a carved bench, or a shallow basin. Villagers refer to these as fairy courts, mystical spaces where the supernatural was said to intermingle with the human world. You step closer, brushing damp moss from your shoes, and feel as if you've stumbled into a medieval miniature theater, frozen mid-performance. A mainstream historical fact, circular stone structures, often found in meadows or near water, were commonly used in medieval Europe for ritual purposes or local gatherings. Some served practical functions like storing tools, while others were linked to folk traditions, including offerings to spirits or celebrations of seasonal cycles. These small enclosures frequently inspired tales of fairies or tiny inhabitants, reflecting the human penchant for populating spaces with personality and purpose. A quirky tidbit. One 14th century chronicler claimed that a particularly daring child sneaked into a fairy court at midnight and returned with a small sprig of mint, insisting the fairies had given it as a gift. Villagers were delighted. The child received praise for bravery and charm, and historians later speculated the mint was probably dug up from a hidden patch, but the story gained a life of its own. You smile, imagining medieval children wondering cautiously, half in reverence, half in mischievous anticipation. Historians still argue whether the fairy court stories were rooted in superstition, actual small-scale ritual practices, or simply imaginative storytelling designed to entertain communities during long evenings. Regardless, these tales impart a sense of gentle wonder, blending observation, play, and imagination seamlessly. You walk among the stone circles, fingertips brushing the lichen-coated walls. Each stone seems to hold a whisper of the centuries, carrying faint impressions of hands that shaped it, prayers murmured, and perhaps even secret laughter. A gentle breeze moves through the valley, rattling dry leaves and stirring the scent of wild thyme. You pause to listen to the valley breathe, the sound of night wrapping around you like a comforting blanket. A fringe detail. Some chroniclers insisted that certain fairy courts could change subtly when unobserved, shifting stone placement overnight to confuse humans or reward the worthy. You crouch near one of the circles, inspecting the ground for signs of movement, half expecting to see tiny footprints or evidence of rearranged stones. The idea that inanimate stone might have a nocturnal life tickles your imagination, and you feel a soft thrill at the thought. The valley is dotted with small, shallow basins carved into the stone, which villagers sometimes filled with water or offerings. You peer into one, seeing the moon reflected faintly in its still surface. It's a serene, almost hypnotic sight, reminiscent of quiet rituals meant to invite luck, protection, or simply contemplation. You imagine villagers kneeling here centuries ago, whispering small secrets or hopes to the reflective water, trusting that the spirits, or perhaps just the stones themselves, would listen. Historians still argue whether the mystical significance of these stone circles was purely symbolic, functional, or both. But standing here, you understand that the perception of magic and meaning mattered as much as reality. The careful arrangement of stone, shadow, and ritual imbued this quiet valley with a subtle hum of wonder. As you rise, brushing the damp moss from your knees, you take a final glance around the fairy court. The moonlight dances across the low walls, and you feel a gentle resonance, a quiet magic lingering in the air. The valley exhales slowly around you, carrying you toward the next marvel, and you step forward, feeling the medieval night envelop you in its soft, curious embrace. The valley slowly widens, the stone fairy courts fading into a gentle meadow speckled with wildflowers and tufts of tall grass. As you move forward, a low, rhythmic drumming reaches your ears. At first, you think it might be the wind rustling through reeds or distant hooves on soft earth, but then you notice the figures themselves, villagers engaged in an unusual evening ritual. They are beating shallow wooden drums in precise, overlapping patterns, eyes closed, faces serene, lost in the hypnotic cadence. This is the medieval practice of sleep music, or gentle rhythmic drumming, intended to calm both the body and mind before rest. A mainstream historical fact, medieval Europeans sometimes employed repetitive sounds, chants, bells, or drum rhythms to influence psychological states. Monastic communities, for instance, practiced rhythmic chanting as a form of meditation or relaxation, while peasants occasionally used simple instruments to create calming environments at home. These practices reflect an understanding, however intuitive, that sound could soothe the human mind and regulate sleep cycles. A quirky tidbit. One chronicler wrote of a village where nightly drumming was so entrancing that even the livestock would settle quietly in their stalls, lulled into a communal doze. Sheep, cows, and chickens, it was claimed, followed the rhythms with almost mechanical obedience. You picture the scene, villagers drumming with soft smiles, animals gently snoring in synchrony, and the surrounding meadow vibrating with a shared, sleepy harmony. Historians still argue whether these drumming sessions were purely practical, part of ritualistic belief, or a combination of both. Some suggest the sounds were meant to ward off night spirits or nightmares, while others maintain they were simple attempts at calming communities after a long day of labor. Either way, the scene has an unexpected serenity, a low hum of life intertwined with sound. You step closer to the circle of villagers, noticing the subtle variations in their techniques. Some tap lightly, producing a delicate patter, while others create deeper, resonant beats that echo softly across the meadow. The combined effect is almost hypnotic, a lullaby woven from human intention rather than song. You feel a gentle tug at your senses, the rhythm coaxing your attention and relaxing your muscles in equal measure. A fringe detail. A few accounts suggest that certain drummers would switch rhythms to induce specific dreams, pleasant visions for the sick, productive imaginings for the young, or even prophetic reveries for those seeking guidance. You can't help but imagine an exhausted medieval mother listening from her doorway, the distant patterned drumming mingling with the scent of evening bread and smoke, the world quieting around her. You kneel briefly in the grass, letting your own hands fall into a tentative rhythm on the soft earth. The vibrations, though faint, resonate under your fingertips, and for a moment, you feel part of the human symphony, a living thread in the tapestry of nocturnal life. Each beat seems to pulse with history, bridging centuries in a gentle, almost imperceptible heartbeat. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or limited to specific regions, but as you rise, the calming effect is undeniable. You walk slowly across the meadow, the drumming gradually fading into the distance, leaving only the subtle whisper of night sounds and your own quiet thoughts. The medieval world has revealed yet another layer of unexpected ingenuity, blending art, comfort, and superstition into something profoundly gentle and mesmerizing. Ahead, a faint glow catches your eye, another anomaly waiting in the moonlit landscape. You take a deep breath of the cool, flower-scented air, feeling the soft pull of curiosity urging you forward. The night, it seems, still has plenty of strange and soothing marvels to share. You leave the meadow and enter a narrow, winding path flanked by tall hedgerows, their leaves whispering softly in the night breeze. The air here is cooler, tinged with the faint, earthy scent of damp soil and fallen leaves. Through the branches, you catch glimpses of candlelight flickering inside small, irregularly spaced huts. As you approach, you realize these are not ordinary homes, but medieval herb houses, tiny cottages devoted entirely to the cultivation and study of medicinal plants. The villagers within move with quiet focus, tending to small beds of chamomile, sage, and valerian, their movements deliberate and almost ritualistic. A mainstream historical fact: herbal medicine played a central role in medieval healthcare. Monks, nuns, and lay practitioners cultivated extensive gardens filled with plants used to treat a variety of ailments, from insomnia to digestive troubles. Recipes were often written in Latin, and many were preserved in manuscripts that combined empirical knowledge with spiritual and symbolic associations. A quirky tidbit: one chronicler describes a monk who, when asked why he lined his chamomile beds with small clay frogs, replied, "They encourage the sleep of those nearby." Scholars speculate whether this was a symbolic gesture, an inside joke, or a curious superstition, but the image is charming nonetheless. You imagine kneeling beside a row of tiny fragrant flowers, clay frogs at the edges, inhaling the soothing aroma, while a gentle breeze ruffles the leaves. Historians still argue whether the combination of practical herbalism and whimsical rituals was widespread or localized to particularly inventive communities. The blending of science, superstition, and gentle humor seems quintessentially medieval, and you find the thought oddly comforting, like the plants themselves might whisper secrets to anyone willing to listen. You step inside the largest hut, its wooden floors creaking softly underfoot. Dried bundles of lavender hang from rafters, releasing a faint, calming scent, and shelves lined with jars of herbs and tinctures glint in the candlelight. A faint scratching sound draws your attention to a small desk where a practitioner is carefully writing notes in a thick manuscript. The scene feels suspended in time, a quiet snapshot of study, patience, and care. A fringe detail. Certain texts suggest that these herbalists sometimes use gentle auditory cues, soft chanting or humming, to encourage the growth of plants, a practice now known to have no botanical effect, but which likely provided a meditative rhythm for caretakers. You hum softly to yourself, feeling strangely connected to the centuries of hands and minds that tended these tiny sanctuaries. The huts are arranged around a small, central courtyard, where a shallow fountain trickles quietly. The gentle sound of water mingles with the faint scent of herbs and the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures. You imagine villagers gathering here after their work, inhaling the fragrant air, sharing soft conversation, and resting before night fully settles. Historians still argue whether some herbal rituals were genuinely believed to enhance plant growth or were more symbolic and psychological in effect. Either way, the medieval herbal houses present a quiet, soothing vision of human ingenuity and care. You linger in the courtyard, breathing deeply, feeling the calm wash over you, your senses attuned to the soft, fragrant symphony of the night. Rising, you step back onto the path, the warm glow of candlelight receding behind you. The air carries a gentle promise of what lies ahead, a peculiar and comforting marvel awaiting at the edge of your next discovery. The medieval world continues to reveal itself, one subtle wonder at a time, and you follow it further into the night. The path opens into a wide, moonlit clearing, dotted with low, earthen mounds, their surfaces patterned with small stones and scattered feathers. You pause, taking in the unusual sight, and realize you've stumbled upon a medieval aviary of sorts, a carefully managed area where villagers bred and trained birds for companionship, communication, and sometimes sport. Hawks, pigeons, and even nightingales flit from mound to mound, their wings brushing softly against the cool night air. The faint calls of owls mix with gentle coos, creating a layered soundscape that seems designed to lull the listener into a state of quiet attention. A mainstream historical fact: falconry and bird breeding were common practices in medieval Europe, especially among nobles, though villagers and monasteries also maintained birds for messengers or song. Birds served practical purposes, companionship, and even symbolic roles in rituals or festivals. Skilled handlers trained them with care, and particular attention was given to diet, exercise, and gentle handling. A quirky tidbit: one chronicler recounts a monk who trained pigeons to deliver small messages written on thin strips of parchment, but who also claimed that the birds occasionally chose their recipients, bringing letters to unexpected villagers and creating mild confusion. You imagine a pigeon pausing mid-flight, scanning the village rooftops, and deciding, ever so whimsically, to drop its note on a baker instead of the intended scribe. The idea is charming, a little absurd, and somehow entirely in keeping with the human-bird dynamic. Historians still argue whether these stories reflect accurate practices or are embellished anecdotes designed to entertain and moralize. Some suggest that chroniclers enjoyed exaggerating minor quirks to make tales more memorable. Regardless, the notion of birds as semi-autonomous participants in human affairs adds a gentle sense of wonder to the scene. You wander among the mounds, careful not to disturb the delicate nests or startle the birds. The night air is filled with the faint rustle of feathers and the subtle scent of straw, earth, and a hint of wildflowers. A small hawk lands nearby, eyeing you curiously before taking off again in a silent, graceful arc. You note the contrast between their wild independence and the careful, patient care of their human attendants. A fringe detail: certain texts hint that some villagers believed birds could carry away minor illnesses or bad dreams, either literally or symbolically. You watch a nightingale perch on a low branch and imagine that perhaps, in some comforting way, the bird is whisking away the day's worries. There's a soft poetry in the thought, blending superstition, symbolism, and attentive care. As you continue across the clearing, you notice the meticulous arrangement of mounds and feeding stations. Each seems designed to promote harmony, prevent disputes among birds, and encourage gentle interaction. The combination of observation, planning, and subtle creativity speaks to a medieval mindset that valued patience, structure, and the unexpected charm of nature. Historians still argue how widespread these bird enclosures were among ordinary villagers, as most records focus on noble or monastic practices. Yet standing here, in the quiet hum of wings and soft calls, it feels entirely plausible that such spaces existed more often than surviving texts suggest. The night is calm, the birds are content, and you move forward with a sense of quiet satisfaction, carrying the gentle rhythm of feathers, coos, and whispered breezes with you. The clearing slowly recedes behind you as you follow a narrow track leading toward the next marvel, the soft moonlight guiding your steps. You feel a subtle intimacy with these small creatures and their caretakers across the centuries, a reminder that medieval ingenuity often found beauty in the smallest, most harmonious gestures. You leave the bird-filled clearing and follow a gently sloping path toward the faint glow of distant torches, their light flickering through the tall grass like tiny, terrestrial stars. The landscape changes gradually into a rolling, open plain dotted with shallow pools reflecting the moon. Here, you notice something utterly peculiar: a medieval water maze, an intricate network of narrow channels, low walls, and stepping stones designed to guide both water and wanderers in playful, puzzling patterns. The villagers constructed these spaces not only for practical irrigation, but also as a form of entertainment and gentle mental exercise, inviting travelers to meander and muse. A mainstream historical fact: Water features and labyrinthine designs were popular in medieval gardens, monasteries, and palaces. They combined aesthetic appeal with practical considerations like irrigation and drainage, and they offered spaces for reflection and leisurely strolls. The careful planning of channels, stones, and plantings created environments that were both functional and subtly meditative. A quirky tidbit: one chronicler described a young apprentice who repeatedly tried to find the center of a labyrinth, only to end up soaking his boots in shallow pools, much to the quiet amusement of his master. Over time, these mazes were seen as exercises in patience, observation, and mild self-discipline, a medieval mindfulness practice, if you will. You step lightly across the stone pathways, enjoying the slow challenge and the sensation of water brushing your ankles. Historians still argue whether these labyrinths were primarily intended for reflection, amusement, or symbolic spiritual journeys. Some suggest that the physical act of wandering through water channels mirrored philosophical or religious paths, while others insist the designs were simply recreational and calming. Regardless, standing here, you appreciate the elegant mixture of function, whimsy, and gentle mental engagement. You notice small carvings at the edges of some stones, sunbursts, spirals, and tiny animal motifs, each marking a subtle landmark in the labyrinth. These details suggest care and a sense of humor, a reminder that even in practical designs, medieval creators enjoyed adding personal flourishes. You run a finger over a spiral pattern, imagining generations of wandering feet tracing the same curve, a soft echo of past curiosity. A fringe observation: certain sources hint that these water mazes sometimes incorporated small fountains or floating objects intended to encourage meditation or inspire contemplation of natural cycles. You watch the water ripple faintly as you step past, the reflections dancing across your vision. There's a gentle hypnotic rhythm in the flowing channels that feels both playful and soothing. The air here carries a faint, refreshing scent of damp earth and aquatic plants. Frogs croak softly in the shallow pools, and a gentle breeze ripples across the surface, turning reflections into liquid mosaics. You pause to inhale deeply, feeling your muscles relax in response to the quiet, purposeful motion of water and stone. The labyrinth is at once a puzzle and a lullaby, designed to engage the mind just enough to soothe it into calm observation. Historians still argue how widespread these water labyrinths were, and whether they were commonly accessible to villagers or reserved for elite estates. Yet, in this open plain, under the moonlit sky, the concept feels accessible, gentle, and universally appealing. You follow the meandering path to its soft conclusion, stepping carefully over each stone, savoring the sensation of ancient creativity blending with natural beauty. Finally, you leave the last shallow pool behind, the labyrinth dissolving into the quiet plain. The night stretches around you, still and expansive, carrying the subtle memory of all the strange and delightful marvels you've encountered tonight. The moon casts long, calm shadows, and a soft, gentle hush fills the air. You feel the medieval world settling into quiet sleep alongside you, each peculiar sight and gentle oddity folding softly into the night, leaving you with a lingering sense of wonder, calm, and slow, reflective joy. The night has grown deeper, and the landscapes of centuries past begin to soften in your mind. You walk slowly across open fields, through forests and meadows, past misty rivers and curious stone circles. Every sight you've encountered tonight, the tiny clay dolls swaying in the mist, the silvered currents of reflective rivers, the patterned haystacks, the drumming in the moonlit meadow, and even the playful water labyrinth feels quieter now, more gentle, like a memory exhaled in a whisper. The oddities of medieval life, once so vivid and surprising, begin to blur into a soothing mosaic of human curiosity and imagination. You feel a warmth in your chest as the senses you carried through the journey settle one by one. The scent of herbs lingers faintly, the sound of flowing water hums softly, and the faint rustle of leaves brushes at the edge of your awareness. Each peculiar marvel of the past, the careful tending of animals, the playful rituals, the tiny offerings to unseen spirits, feels like a delicate thread connecting you to generations long gone. There is comfort in knowing that across centuries, humans have sought to ease their minds, entertain themselves gently, and find wonder in the small and ordinary. As you exhale, your body relaxes further. The night stretches endlessly, yet you feel safe, accompanied by the quiet rhythm of a world that is curious, patient, and strangely tender. Allow your thoughts to drift, imagining the moonlight falling across medieval fields and gardens, the soft ripples in still pools, the gentle coos of birds resting in the dark. Let your awareness slow, the details fading just enough to allow your own mind to rest, carrying only the soft echo of centuries-old wonder. With every slow breath, the medieval world settles around you like a protective blanket. The peculiar, the whimsical, and the gently bizarre fold into quietness, leaving a calm, warm sense of continuity. You are safe, you are steady, and you are ready to let sleep take over, gently, without hurry. Imagine the soft night air brushing your face, and let the last traces of adventure dissolve into dreams.